Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are new here, I'm Chen Zhiwu, the director of the Asia Global Institute. So we have been organizing the Global Thinkers series. As you can see, we only bring global stars to this occasion to share with us their thoughts and experience, as well as research. Of course, today, you can see that it's very hard to believe that given all Greeks are philosophers, there can actually be populism in Greece, right? There seems to be a contradiction between being philosophical and deep and populism. So that's why I thought unless you are a born Greek and if you have not taken our Common Core courses at Hong Kong U, you should really do that because that's the only way to prepare you to be future global leaders. Because Mr. Papandreou has shown to us, he has such a breadth of knowledge and a long portfolio of experience. And of course, I think in the future he can, if no other universities are interested to him, Hong Kong U can be a good place for him to do philosophical work.
Thank you very much.
With that aside, I would like to organize the Q&A, my part of the Q&A in the following way. First, I will ask some questions starting from Greece, and then move up to the EU, and then to the globe, okay? But of course, that sounds really like a long list, given that I have about 15 or 20 minutes, so I'll try to be very brief. First, let's start with Greece. So since you were the prime minister, of course, you were in the middle of the heat 8 or 9 years ago. So from your time all the way to now, how do you grade your performance and your successors' performance in taking Greece out of the crisis?
Starting with Greece, I just want to begin by a comment on the ancients. The populists, then, we didn't call them in ancient Greece populists, we called them demagogues. And maybe that's a better word, even for today. And Aristotle and Plato said there are two issues that bring out this demagoguery, and that is, one is inequality, and the other one is lack of education. So I think these two issues are quite pertinent even from that ancient time. But there is an interesting discussion because what developed at some point were the sophists in ancient Greece, and that was basically to win a sort of a training to win an argument, whether it's good or bad, just to learn how to win an argument. And win an argument also just to get power. So they were the sophists, and there was a very interesting discussion between Socrates and Gorgias, who was a sophist, and Socrates was saying, well, why do you want power? And what are you going to do in your life? Why is that so special? So I think these discussions are actually relevant even for today. The financial crisis in Greece was, of course, partly of our making. As I mentioned earlier, we had in some areas bad governance, institutions that were not transparent, so that one of the basic ideas for me was to reorganize our governance system. Now, why was governance bad in Greece? One has to go a little bit into history of each country, and we went through dictatorships, we went through civil wars. Our state government was basically one of oppression. It wasn't, or of control, and not really of helping the economy moving, or helping entrepreneurship, or supporting the citizen. A lot of clientelism, crony capitalism, and even when we got into the European Union, we were not asked to make major changes. So this came out once we got into the euro. Some of these problems came out, and the government, before I took over, overspent, unluckily A lot of money went awry. So what I felt I had to do is really deep reforms. So things like what I mentioned earlier, the e-prescription, but also bringing in transparency to fight corruption, clientelism, more meritocratic. So things like, for example, I passed a simple law saying there is no public expenditure, whether it's local, central government, regional government, no expenditure is legal unless it is published on the web. So we had a website, everything had to be published. Well, that immediately helped fight, whether it's waste, whether it's wrong decisions, or whether it was even corruption. This was immediately something important. What happened from the European Union side was that there was a little bit more, and particularly from, I would say, more Germany being at the head of this, felt that, well, since you've overspent, you have to be, you now have to be thrifty, so just cut. And I was saying, well, yeah, we need to cut, but we need to really, that's the tip of the iceberg, we need to really rethink how we organize governance so that we aren't losing money. We aren't spending money in the wrong places. So I think one of the problems with the way Greece was approached was, rather than reforms, it was simply austerity. Sort of like taking a company that's not really producing something that people are buying, not very competitive, and you say, oh, you're in debt, the only thing you have to do is just cut your debt, cut the wages, when you really actually need to innovate, to bring in new technologies, to reorganize your company, maybe to invest in new areas. So this is not, I think that was one of the problems Greece had. A second problem was that the euro has problems itself, and initially the reaction to Greece was, this is a Greek problem. No, it's not a European problem. You are to blame. As I said earlier, these lazy Greeks and so on. Let's punish them a little bit too. Everything will be fine. But actually, it was also a euro problem. It was a problem of the euro, an architecture, a common currency with very different economies. So you may have the same interest rates from the ECB, but very different economies, different competitiveness, different rates of borrowing in the global markets. So this created problems. I won't get into the details, if you like. I can, of some of the flaws of the euro system. The third, of course, issue was that this was a global problem. We had just come out of the financial crisis. Actually, we hadn't come out. We were still part of this financial, and the markets were very risk averse. So this was very difficult to convince the markets that reforms would be followed. That meant what happened is, in the end, a program of adjustment which should have been for 2.5 years ended up being 8.5 years. We just finished our adjustment program with a lot of sacrifices. Greek people, as I said, we lost 25% GDP. At some point, youth unemployment was over 50%. You can imagine the pain. But still, the Greek people have endured. The Greek people also decided we will stay within the euro and, of course, within Europe. Sort of in juxtaposition to what the British decided, and highly, for many reasons, also political reasons. We wanted stability, we wanted to be in the core of Europe, and now Greece is, I think, on a path, slow but stable growth and a more stable, if you like, economy and system, and many opportunities for investment. So yes, I could go back and grade myself and say I could have done this and I could have done that. But when you're in the middle of the crisis and you have to make decisions at that moment, and we're talking about just one more thing, just to understand when we talk about crisis today and the speed of the crisis, our institutions are not prepared for the speed of change. I remember speaking to an audience like this, a little bit larger, and there were trade unions. I was on the podium, and I was telling them something very difficult. I was saying, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to cut your pensions. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut your wages. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut some of your benefits. Not a happy speech. And I said, I'll have to do this because otherwise we'll go bankrupt. Now, my speech was in Greek, and it was being translated by, I think, Reuters, a number of global networks. And some translator actually mistranslated me and said that I was announcing that Greece was going bankrupt. Now that news traveled around the globe before I got off the podium. So when I got off the podium, the whole world thought that I had said that Greece is going bankrupt. Now, of course, we corrected it, but the damage was done. So I'm just giving you an example of the types of crises we in politics have to deal with today, which are beyond our human capacity to really adapt.
Thank you. So we're going to return to the euro problem. First, let's deal with the Greek problem. You spoke a moment ago about bankruptcy. According to Rogoff and Carhart, when they published this great book, this time it's different. They collected all the bankruptcy cases for European and other countries since 1800, so over the last 200 some years. And then Greek comes way at the top, comes out way at the top. So over the last, I added the recent experience. So over the last 218 years, Greece has defaulted about 6 times. But out of the 218 years, the Greek government has been in default for 113 years. So roughly 52% of the years, the Greek government has been in default. So in that sense, of course, Spain is next. Spain has defaulted many more times, but they usually resolved this renegotiation process relatively quickly. So it seems like there has been this tradition, if I can use this word, of overspending by Greek governments and at different times, and then default. So in that sense, I mean, what we saw over the last 8 years, in my mind, is more like a Greek problem. And then on the other hand, I know that you're the champion now. You're the chairman of the Socialist International. So we're promoting socialism, make the Greek experience more widely shared or adopted in the future. Anyway, my point is, so you faced a very tough cultural challenge 8 years ago, given the welfare system that the Greek people had enjoyed for so long. Especially, I know for a lot of Chinese people, they wished a few years ago that they could live lives like the Greek were having. So where do you think Greece will go, especially being a member of the EU and the Eurozone, given this socialist or welfare tradition? I know many people around the world have been wondering about this. So Greece has such a long history and has contributed so much to the Western civilization and so on.
Yeah. There's a false image that it was socialist policies that created problems in Greece. In fact, it was crony capitalism that created problems in Greece. The previous government was a right-wing government. They doubled the debt. I didn't double the debt. I, as a social democrat, cut the debt, and I cut the deficit. In 1 year, we cut the deficit by 5%. We're number 1 in OECD on that. No other country did that. So I very much disagree that this rhetoric that the socialists or social democracy is to blame for our debt. As a matter of fact, I would say that if we had greater equality and greater redistribution of income, we would have more growth and we would have better economies. What we saw in Greece was more crony capitalism and corruption. And that was what I was fighting against. That doesn't mean we can suspend whatever we want, no. But we do want a more equitable system. And I feel if we take models like the Nordic models in Europe, we can see that investing in human capital, investing in better wages, investing in childcare so women can work, investing in a secure environment, can actually help a country be competitive, innovative, and a sense of security. So I take task to the idea that this is all these bad socialists. Now, of course, democracy and socialism are words which are used by everybody in a derogatory or in a positive way. So, democracy will be used by DPRK also. Okay. We have to understand what we need. And we're talking about social democracy. We're talking about the core of what European values are. The European value was our social contract where we say yes to capitalism, but let's humanize capitalism. Let's make sure that everybody can benefit. And let's not make sure we don't have marginalized groups. Let's make sure that people can be involved. Let's make sure people all have a voice and can participate. I think that's the basis. I think that is a problem in our world. Now, if we talk about Greece in particular, it's very easy to look at the statistics, and I know you're a fan of this, and you're doing great work on quantifying history, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And big data is a very important tool for our world today.
That's why I dug out all the Greek history,
statistics.
so the
Good.
statistics.
But you also need to look underneath the data. For example, one of our last bankruptcies was when Germany occupied Greece and took out a forced loan from the Greek central bank. And the Greek economy was destroyed and we had a famine. People were dying in the streets of Athens out of not having food. So yes, it was a bankruptcy, but this was an occupation. Previously it was World War I, and we had a civil war then too. We went bankruptcy. So if you look at Greece, we had occupations, civil wars. Yeah, it wasn't a stable area in the world. But I think what we've reached a point now is where within the European Union, we have been challenged to build a governance system which is much more transparent and also somewhat more controlled. So actually when I became Prime Minister, one of the first things I did was to create an independent statistics bureau. Doesn't sound very radical, huh? But it is the basis of transparency. I mean, you're talking about data. Because the previous government had actually fudged the numbers, we didn't know what our deficit was. One of our major problems was not only that they had fudged the numbers, but when it was revealed that the government had fudged the numbers and said that our deficit was 6% when it actually was 15.6%. Of course, the market said, we don't trust you. The worst deficit we had was not our debt, was not our competitive deficit, it was our trust deficit. And we had to rebuild trust. So that was the one thing I did. I remember actually, it was so independent that one day I called up my finance minister and I said, I'm going to give a speech tomorrow, and they're going to release statistics tomorrow on how we're doing, how our deficit is going. Can you send me the numbers so I can talk about them the day before? The head of the Statistics Bureau said, sorry, you have to wait till tomorrow. So there was no way we could get into it. So creating institutions in Greece, I think now is making it a much more stable, transparent country. But also part of the recent debt problem was also part of the euro problem. What happened was that banks over-lended. They were saying, oh, Greece is getting good interest rate, let's just give money to, and of course this was just one of the many bubbles the banking system created. I mean, the US almost went down the drain. At the same time, Spain, UK, Scotland Bank, and so on. This was a global situation. So I think it's too simple to say, yeah, Greece has had many bankruptcies, unless we look at some of the underlying causes. But I don't say that we didn't have our problems. We do, and that's what I had. And that's actually I was elected on a slogan which was either we change or we sink, and that rhymes in Greek. Now, as far as my friend Rogoff, he does have good statistics, but I think one student in Cornell, I think, uncovered that he had actually fudged his statistics too.
I saw that report why the Greek financial crisis was going on. That's good work. So, speaking of statistics, many of you may know the Chinese unemployment rate has always been at 5% for many decades. So here you go. But let's move to the euro problem or the eurozone issues. It's very clear that one of the contributions made by the eurozone, the union, is that everyone can actually blame their problem on the EU or the eurozone. Okay, so I think to some extent the Greek people just used that option as well. They blamed everything on the eurozone, especially without a Greek central bank being able to print its own currency. Many people thought, that took away our major weapon to deal with financial challenge, especially fiscal challenges. So I understand that when you were prime minister, you did make quite a few threats to pull out of the eurozone and so on. I understand that was very important, a very important tool to use for negotiations. So looking back, in your view, for Greece, being a member of the eurozone has been a plus for Greece or negative?
A good question. When we faced this crisis, I remember we had a number of options, and I sat down with my financial team, my ministers, and I said, okay, let's put the options on a whiteboard. I said whiteboard, and I wrote down one option, bankruptcy. Another option, we leave the euro. Maybe both, bankruptcy and leaving the euro. Third option, we adjust and we stay within the euro. So we actually sat down and talked about these options and we decided that none of them were happy options. I mean, that's in politics and sometimes in life too. You don't have the best, the ideal choice. You have choices in life which are there. So I mean, a good choice would be go to paradise and say, let's build a paradise, and which a lot of politicians talked about afterwards, and this is the sort of demagogic politician we're talking about. And in next elections, they were elected. Actually, one of our classmates, Alex and mine classmates, Antonis Samaras, we were together in Amherst College. He was elected after me, and but he was promising, the world, and we didn't have to make any changes. We didn't just go ahead on our own merry way. So, but we had these options, and out of these three options, we decided that the best way would be to stay within the euro. Now, there's another question which you also mentioned, and I'll tell you a little bit of the ramifications of leaving the euro. But should we have gotten into the euro when we did? Possibly not. Maybe we should have waited. Maybe we should have done more restructuring of our economy and be better prepared, so that our economy was more competitive once we got into a common currency. Should we have should the parity of the drachma, or the converting of the drachma to the euro, we had it about 330 drachmas to a euro. Maybe it should have been 400 drachmas. Maybe it should have been 500 drachmas. So we didn't buy the euro so cheaply, which really boosted prices and undermined our competitiveness. So these are, in hindsight, many issues. Had we left, however, once we were in the euro, we estimated that there would have been bankruptcy, first of all. We weren't sure where we would have been able to get money. We most likely would not have been able to pay our civil servants, whether it's teachers, doctors, military, or whatever, for a long time, pensions and so on. We are an importing country. We don't have many exports. That's one of our problems. So, for example, energy. prices. The drachma would immediately inflation. We would lose value from changing currency. So possibly our energy prices would go up 50%, 100%. So any competitive edge we would gain, we would then immediately lose. So we decided that this would be a wrong thing to do. Now, had we expected that this would take 8.5 years of adjustment and not just 2 or 3 years, which was the proposed program, we may have rethought our ideas. But at that time, the way we saw things, we said, let's stay in the euro. Now, repeated governments have talked about leaving euro, but the Greek people actually say, no, we want to stay in the euro. Euro has created also a sense of stability, even though it's painful. The drachma, which we had before, used to have wild ups and downs. Interest rates for borrowing were much, much higher. So for business, for the future of Greece, people do say, yes, we do want to stay within this currency, even for economic reasons, despite the costs. So that's basically how we came up with this idea, with this decision.
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, politics are local and national. On the one hand, on the other hand, the euro is a monetary union, really without fiscal union or any political union. So do you think Europe is going to go back to the old days with so many decentralized or totally independent sovereign city-states and national states, or you expect sometime soon to have a political union, so to speak, so that everything would be more internally consistent with each other? So that way, politics will no longer be just local, as well as pan-EU or at least the Eurozone.
I think that's the major challenge you're mentioning right now about where Europe will go. And it could go either way. I don't know if I put a statistic to it, but on the one hand, you see a movement because of we are a complex system. We've given up a lot of our sovereignty to Brussels and to the European institutions. As sometimes when the European institutions are slow on making decisions or very complicated, or sometimes decisions people don't like, the sense that we're not moving forward, the sense that Europe is not delivering what it should be delivering, does create a pushback. And people say, oh, maybe we need to go back to our nation state. Maybe this European Union should be much looser. So we have that tendency. And a lot of the demagogues we have in Europe are talking about that. Let's leave Europe, or let's leave the euro, or let's undermine the power of Brussels. On the other hand, you have people that say, no, actually, if we do want to deal with the global problems, and we do want, let's say, a euro to be working, we need more integration. So we need, let's say, fiscal policy, not just monetary policy, but we need fiscal policy, coordinated fiscal policy. Therefore, we need, let's say, a minister of economy for Europe who will look at transfers, will look for investment, will look at, maybe more common health system, pension system, so on, labor market, more fluid, more flexible within the European Union. So these are types of things which and of course, security and foreign policy. I would be more on the second. I mean, my view would be let's move more to European integration. And I see that that's the only way we'll be able to deal with some of the major challenges in the world. And it's the only way Europe will be a power to deal with, and I hope a moderating power in the global society. At the same time, simply giving up your sovereignty to a central bureaucracy is not enough. Because it is true, people feel that a lot of the decisions that are being made in Europe are being made by bureaucrats or by sort of behind-the-scene deals which are not really transparent. So I think democratizing the actual functioning of Europe is also important. For example, I've been a proponent, there are others too, why not elect our president of the commission by, popular election? Whether it's through delegates or direct elections, that's another question, but let's have a system. We could do that. So a Jean-Claude Juncker could be elected by the people of Europe. That person would then have democratic legitimacy to state that and speak on behalf of the European people. That person would also be, in politics, they would have to debate policies. We would have to vote on policies rather than simply to vote on our national elected officials that can go to the European Parliament and have their basically national views. So I think we need to think of maybe more deliberation with our citizens so that they feel part of this project. Because Europe really has been, from its inception, an elite project. Jean Monnet, who was one of the inspirers of the European project, basically saw it as an elite project, an incremental decision-making of elites to slowly integrate different countries together. But I think now we need more and more to bring in our citizens to be part of this process and make Europe a citizens' project more than an elite project. So I think these are legitimate issues, but your question is at the heart, I think, of where Europe is now at. Will Europe move forward to deeper integration, or will it be forces that are more centrifugal and undermining this more European unity?
So this is a very tough challenge. It makes us appreciate how hard it must have been for the first Chinese emperor to actually integrate so many regions and nation states 2,300 years ago. So I wish you a lot of luck in that. But let me still give you guys some time to ask some more friendly questions, okay?
Not necessarily friendly. Whatever you like.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for giving us such an first-hand account of what happened in Greece and the implications for Europe and the rest of the world. But first of all, my name is I'm a strategist. I'd like to return to the title, Populism and right-wing nationalism. Now, sir, you mentioned inequality. You mentioned the sense of injustice. And of course, to a certain extent, that's explained or that can be attributed in some way to how capitalism has been performing in recent decades. Yeah. Of course, capitalism has done wonders, but in recent years, it's led to great concentration of wealth, as you have highlighted, and a great sense of inequality, as of course also demonstrated in Thomas Piketty's seminal work, Capitalism in the 21st Century. Yes. So if capitalism seems to be, have all this negative impact, not only on peoples, but also in the concept of globalization, because globalization and capitalism are tied together, and how do you address this conundrum, which of course leads to the sense of inequality and injustice, and so on, and how do you address that? Thank you very much indeed.
Good and difficult question. Capitalism has its dynamic, it has its disruptive and creative force. Schumpeter wrote about this too. And what, from my point of view, politically, the social democracy did is we said, okay, how can we humanize capitalism? And that was a social contract. It wasn't let's stop, let's do away with market. No. How can we make sure that it also, some of its excesses are humanized so that we actually have, yes, profit making, but also a good welfare system. Now we have the challenge of environment and so on. The problem now is that because it's global, capital doesn't have a home. They're not a patriot to any country. They're a patriot to their own business. How then do you, at a global level, create some kind of regulation which will deal with some of these excesses? So, for example, tax havens. There are supposedly trillions and trillions of dollars there, which should normally be taxed. There's a big discussion now in the Congress of the United States. I don't know how effective they will be, even with big companies like Apple, Google. They have their headquarters somewhere else where they pay maybe 1%, 2% on their profits. And of course, these profits don't go back to the US government or any other government. They basically stay in with the shareholders. Okay, I can understand the shareholders are very happy. But this also creates an economy which is more a financial economy than a real economy. You have this buyback economy. Rather than investing in, jobs, factories, or whatever new forms of technology or research and so on, you just sort of basically recirculate the money within the stock market. These are problems we need to deal with. Second issue is we need to think about the environment. This is a global issue. So how do we regulate? How do we make sure that sustainable development goals are dealt with in a positive way? So we need to see a multilateral system in place, not a dog-eat-dog, not going back to this ultra-nationalist view where everybody's going to fight for their little piece of whatever, land, economy, or whatever, or competitiveness, where we can actually regulate the global economy in a way that makes it more just and more viable, more sustainable. Capitalism will not solve climate change. There may be good innovations, there may be good technologies, but if you let it just rampant, well, why not continue with the carbon energy, CO2 emissions? You need regulation to say. So Piketty has come up with some ideas, for example, global tax. There have been ideas, we in the Socialist International have talked about a tax on energy. Many economists say that would be maybe a global tax on energy, on CO2, not on energy, on CO2, which could also be redistributive to countries that need to develop their infrastructure, their energy, their sustainable. So you would have that would be taxing more of the rich and giving to poorer countries like in Africa that don't have that capacity right now, but they would have to be able to, you would help them actually in developing new forms of sustainable types of energy. Will we work together in dealing with global health problems, pandemics? People are talking not about if there will be a new pandemic, but when there will be a new pandemic. So it is absolutely necessary that we see this planet as one whole where we do need certain types of cooperation and regulation rules amongst ourselves. So the demagogic nationalism we're seeing is the exact opposite of what our planet needs. At a time where we can only solve the problems through cooperation and understanding and some global regulation, we are seeing people thinking that they can simply close themselves off and everything will be fine, or that's the way to deal with it. It won't work. So, but it's a big challenge. So this is, I think, what I know Victor here is really gung-ho about this idea, very strong proponent of how we see this multilateral system, how we reorganize this multilateral system in many areas. And I think that's our challenge for political leaders. We do have our domestic concerns. I'm not so domestic anymore because I'm basically out of daily politics in Greece. So I can sort of free myself from the day-to-day thinking of domestic politics and be a little bit more lofty. But it's more difficult, let me put it that way. It's more difficult, it's more challenging. But this is the challenge of the time. We'll have to do it. Now, there may be a younger generation which is much more connected, much more in touch with each other. I would say also much more sensitive to these issues, ready to mobilize, sometimes maybe falsely empowered. They feel empowered, but they're falsely empowered through Facebook and things like that, or maybe WeChat, I don't know. But so maybe they have to be more active rather than simply on the internet and the web. But yes, maybe this younger generation will be able to work together across borders in a more global way. So let's invest in them.
So given the time, given the fact that we're already behind schedule, let me just take one more question.
Vera Kobalia, Asia Global Fellow. So in 2010, you announced from Castellorizo Island that Greece is entering IMF support program. We spoke about this a bit today. But in hindsight of the effects that your decision back then had on Greece economy in Europe, what would you do differently today? And very quickly, a second question on the future of leadership. You often speak about a lack of character-driven leadership in Europe. To me, it looks like the Churchills of today are working in investment banking and they choose to work in private sector. So how should the bureaucratic institutions change in countries, national or local institutions, in order to allow the future bright minds to enter political systems again? Thank you.
By the way, Vera is one of our 12 current Asia Global Fellows, and she is a former Minister of Economy in Georgia.
Ah, very good, Georgia. Very well. Thanks. Bravo, bravo. What could I do different? I mean, I could think of many things. You know, this is sort of, in the US, they call it Monday morning quarterbacking. Yeah? You look at the game and you say, oh, they should have thrown the ball that way or this way. But at that moment, you know, you don't really have that hindsight. I think I did what I could at that point. Greece was facing bankruptcy. I had a choice. I could have said, okay, let's just let Greece go bankrupt, or let's risk it. It might go bankrupt, might not. So a lot of people say, why didn't you let Greece go bankrupt? And even many Greeks say that, let Greece go bankrupt. And then I asked them, well, what if I had let Greece go bankrupt and you were in a much worse situation? Would you be happy? So I had to take what I felt was the most logical or best road of the roads I had to choose. Could I have chosen a better road? It didn't seem there were any other ones. Had there been another one, yes, I could have done it. I didn't want to, let me just give you a little bit of the history that's short, but not history, but of the time. What I was asking for is not a bailout. I didn't want a bailout. I was saying to my dear friend Angela Merkel, I was saying, we had already started making reforms and cutting the deficit and so on. Everybody was applauding. Bravo, you're doing good, and so on. I said, okay, since we're doing good, what I want you to do is tell the bond markets that you trust the Greek economy and that you will support the Greek economy. Just the words. I don't mean give us money. What Draghi actually did 2 years later, he came out and he said, I will do whatever it takes. I will buy the bonds of Italy and Spain on the secondary markets so that the markets will not speculate. And it worked. He really didn't, he didn't really have to, it didn't have to go into bailout programs. So if Angela Merkel had done that, then she said, no, the markets will understand, don't worry. The markets didn't understand. So I reached the point where the interest rates for borrowing was going up so high that there was sort of a vicious circle. You know, when you get into debt and then people say, I'll give you a loan, but it'll be 10%. And then you say, oh, okay. And then you can't get more loans. You go to another guy, a loan shark, and he says, yeah, but 20% now. Well, then you end up going bankrupt. So we were getting into that spiral. I had to negotiate the creation of this mechanism for bailouts. We didn't have one in the European Union. We said, no, we had legally said there will be no bailouts. We didn't expect to have a crisis. So we thought that through this legal way, no crisis would occur. So we actually had to create this bailout. So I actually had to go and access this mechanism because we couldn't access the markets. So to pay off our debt, we had to access money that was given by other countries in the European Union. It became quite acrimonious because, of course, then the taxpayers of other countries were saying, why are we lending Greece? It became a big issue. So this was quite a tense area, tense in Europe. But I don't see that I could have made a different decision at that time. Now your other question on leaders. I think there are a number of issues behind that question, which I'd like to quickly address. Sort of. One is we are living in a representative democracy. Now there are other forms of democracy too, and if you go back to ancient Greece, it was more direct and more deliberative. can we bring some form of more deliberative participation of citizens into our politics? Why should we have only, let's say, in Greece, 300 legislators making decisions every 4 years and not have more participation of citizens during? The ancient Greeks also had another system, which was a lottery system. So they would say every citizen is equal. We will create tribunals to make policy, and we'll just draw a lottery from our citizens. And pretty much every citizen, not everybody was a citizen, that's a different question. Women were not citizens, slaves were not citizens, but those who were citizens did have that same right. And every citizen most likely was in a public office twice in their life. So let's assume that in Hong Kong, you could say how that every citizen of Hong Kong, twice in their life, will be in a public position, part of government. So let's make sure government is really more close to people. Can we use the internet? The agora, the ancient agora, was a marketplace, but also a place for deliberation. Agora in Greek has two meanings. It's a market, but it's also publicly speaking. So politics and business was actually were unified in one place. And they made a decision there. Now the internet gives us this possibility, but what's happened with the internet is that it has splintered us rather than united us. So we have our silos, our cocooning, our own groups, our tribes. What if we created a societal government, legislative sponsored agora through the internet, and we deliberated? Well, I tried to do that when I was Prime Minister. We did something called wiki laws. Every law, before it went to Parliament, we discussed it in the Cabinet, then we put it on the web. We got people to make comments, and then the Minister had to come back to the Cabinet and tell us what he accepted from all the propositions from this deliberation process from our citizens. And then it went to Parliament. So we could refine this process and make it much more deliberative. So that would mean that you would have wisdom of the crowd also, or the collective wisdom also, which now, as many scientists are talking about, some Yale professors also worked on this, as a new way of looking at politics. Another issue, can we take money out of politics, or the big money out of politics? Politics is captured. I know Georgia fought a lot on the issue of corruption. There's a bit of controversy about what Saakashvili did or not, but that was a big issue. We had similar issues. Other countries have issues. But big money is corrupting politics. We are ending up not representing the people. One man or one woman, one vote, not really true, because other people's vote count much more when they put in money than your vote if you don't have any money. Now, some of that has been slightly changed with crowdsourcing money and in politics and so on, but still, money plays a major role. So I think that's another area. And I also believe that we have to build a younger leadership. I'm now working, and I was actually working with some people in China. I hope maybe here with the Asian global forum that you have. If we could really build up a leadership, a younger leadership, because the idea of leadership, there's too many stereotypes about what leadership means. I think it's very, sort of the knee-jerk reaction of a leader is somebody who pounds, his fist, and usually a his rather than a her, fist on a desk and, really makes these decisions and so on. But leadership is actually much more how you involve people for change, to adapt, and make difficult decisions, of course, very difficult decisions. And you don't have to make difficult decisions with a lot of fanfare. You have to try to make them in a way which people understand are necessary, and so you have to bring people, involve people. So leadership is very different, I think, and I think we need to invest in training young leaders in what it means to lead in a more complex and difficult time. You know, we sometimes think that there are snap solutions, easy solutions, and there are in some things. You know, some things are technical solutions. You know, when you have a heart attack, there are certain standard procedures for going into the intensive care. They're standard procedures. That's a technical solution. But if you're going to change your lifestyle so you don't have another heart attack, start doing exercise, doing a diet, maybe your relationship in your family is not too good, maybe your work is stressing you too much, that takes much different type of adaptation and leadership. So that is what politics is and should be, to really see how we can change society. And politics in the ancient terms, the ancient idea of politics, and I'll finish with that, because we say politics, and it's a dirty word today, huh? Politics, I'm not in politics, I'm not in politics. But the word politics means basically being a citizen. It comes from the word polis, which means city. Citizen is politics. And the ancient Greeks, what happened in ancient Athens was a revelation where most societies were saying, yeah, it's fate. You know, we live, you know, there's a king, there's an emperor, there's a tyrant, whatever, a god. Our fate is there. We were born into this position. We really can't change what's happening. You know, we can't really change the world. This is the structure. What happened in these small cities was, you know, actually we can change things. Actually, we can take our fate into our own hands. Actually, politics is we can imagine a better future. And let's collectively try to do it. And if we can do that, and people can actually change their fate, then let's invest in people. Let's educate them. Let's do theater. Let's do philosophy. Let's do math. Let's do a lot of games, Olympic games, but all kinds of games, which will train us to be the best of citizens. And make sure that power is not usurped by one. And that was what, of course, democracy was. So that was sort of a disruptive force. So I would like to see that reinventing politics, rethinking politics in today's world. Can we again bring this idea of imagination? Yes, collectively we can change the world. We can work together. There is a possibility. Not easy. It's messy sometimes, but it's there. This is what we need to bring back for not only leaders, but for our citizens. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So given that Trump has been the president of the United States, letting a random draw pick future leaders for the world will actually do pretty well, right? So on this positive note, I have to say that now we understand, even from a Greek perspective, multilateralism and new technology will make us all more positive, optimistic about the future of the world. So let's give our one more last applause to the speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you.